Hello and welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Before we begin today, remember to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel and join our international community. Now, today's report is going to concern an issue that we have been following since pretty much the beginning of this year, which has been the Russo-Ukraine Crisis. Now, in previous reports, what we were talking about was a diplomatic crisis. But Russia's actions today have essentially ended this diplomatic crisis and began an open and armed conflict. Now, most nations and most world leaders are going to state that the diplomatic crisis is continuing and the war has not began. Nonetheless, yesterday, Russian President Vladimir Putin, in a long 1-hour speech that sounded rambling and unhinged, where he talked about Ukraine's history and stated a lot of falsehoods about how Ukraine is actually rightfully the territory of Russia. It's not. He would follow up by recognizing the so-called independent separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, these two regions are located in what is known as the Donbas area in eastern Ukraine. These separatists and rebels have been fighting for independence from Ukraine in these regions since 2014, notably since Russia annexed Crimea. Now, Vladimir Putin has officially recognized these two separatist republics as essentially independent states that are fighting against Ukraine for independence, for their own independence, and what we can all assume to eventually be joining Russia. Now, finally, the Russian legislature has approved Vladimir Putin and the executive branch of Russia to be allowed to use military force outside of Russia to enact its security interests. Now, it should be stated that Russia is not a democratic country and that its legislative bodies are completely controlled by the executive branch and the Kremlin. This decision is solely coming from the office of Vladimir Putin. Yes, there are people voting for it. Yes, they're saying they support it, but the vast majority are being forced or pressured by the Kremlin. Even if they are supporting it, they're being pressured. And if they don't support it, well, they have to vote for it anyways. Now, it should be noted that many world leaders have reacted to this already. Now, a lot have imposed sanctions, as has been talked about over the past week, or the past few weeks. Now, a few world leaders and a few countries have stated that this is an incursion on Ukrainian territory, but it is not an invasion, which is completely false. The reality is that Russian soldiers have moved into eastern Ukraine, into the Donbas area. Now, the Donbas area and the separatist regions who are fighting for independence from Ukraine are still internationally recognized as the territory of Ukraine. Russia, formally and openly sending soldiers into this territory is an invasion, period. The war has begun. Now, it should be stated that Russian soldiers have been involved in these regions since 2014. Now, Russia has denied this, and these soldiers have not been wearing Russian uniforms. So these have essentially been covert operations, not an open invasion. Now, furthermore, it should be stated that the Russian government denies that it has deployed troops already into Donbas and that Russian soldiers aren't already there. But that is a bullshit lie. The reality is that armored convoys of vehicles and tanks have been seen traveling through separatist territory, separatist resources that they typically do not have. And other separatist leaders in the regions have already confirmed, in a form of a thank you, that Russian soldiers are there. And I'm going to repeat this one more time. Donbas is still internationally recognized as a portion of the territory of Ukraine. Russian soldiers entering this territory is an invasion. Now, the diplomatic tensions that began essentially as a dispute between Russia, the United States, and its NATO allies was caused by Russia building up, at the time, 100,000 troops along Ukraine's border. Now the buildup is estimated to be around 150,000. Basically, Russia made simple demands. Well, not simple, really complicated demands that will never be realized. Russia made the demands that Ukraine be permanently banned from joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In addition to this, that other former Soviet countries also be banned from permanently joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And finally, that the US and its NATO allies stop sending soldier deployments in Eastern Europe and other military assets such as weapons or military resources. Now, these demands obviously were laughable and non-starters for the West, and this has led to the buildup of tensions, which has eventually culminated in this point of Russia formally recognizing these separatist regions and sending soldiers on a peacekeeping operation into Donbas. Now, in addition to this, Vladimir Putin, after sending these soldiers and recognizing the independence of these regions, has demanded that the international community recognize Crimea, a region and peninsula that Russia annexed in 2014, something that was completely against international law. Now, it should be stated that to Russia's credit, the people of Crimea did vote in a questionable public mandate of whether or not they wanted to be members of Ukraine, whether or not they felt that they were independent or they wanted to be part of Russia. The vast majority allegedly voted that they wanted to be part of Russia. Now, Vladimir Putin is only insisting that Crimea get its recognition as part of Russia as the people want it, reflecting the self-determination of the people in that country, comparing Crimea to Kosovo. Now, it should be stated that Kosovo is a part of Serbia. It will never be an independent country, no matter how many other nations recognize it, and the same goes for Crimea. Now, I do finally want to state that I do sound very anti-Russian right now, and that's because fundamentally I am. This is a conflict between the United States and Russia and the US's Western allies. As an American, obviously I'm going to take the side of my country. While I do try and be unbiased in all of my reports, this is an outright conflict, and I have a duty to be loyal to my nation. Nonetheless, I do feel that Russia and Vladimir Putin are simply working towards their international interest, which is securing Ukraine. It should be understood that Ukraine in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or even a Ukraine that is not fully working in step with Russia, is a threat to Russia's national security. But who gives a shit? The reality is that Ukraine's potential to join NATO one day is important for the integrity of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is crucial to the United States being able to carry out its interests across the world. Now, whether or not you agree with me, that's okay. The US fundamentally needs to look out for its interest as well by spreading NATO, by spreading democracy, which usually it doesn't, it just spreads war, but it needs to keep carrying out US interest. It should be kept in mind that this conflict and this war will be fought between Russian soldiers, separatist soldiers, Ukrainian volunteers, civilians, militias, and the Ukrainian military. In reality, is a conflict between Russia and the United States. Now, this is an invasion at the end of the day. And fundamentally, a lot of people believe that an invasion was going to be avoidable. I myself, in the past few weeks, have been stating that an invasion is going to be avoided. The reality is an invasion happened today. And some people are still thinking that this is not an invasion and that this is just another diplomatic step by Vladimir Putin and by Russia in brinkmanship to build up tensions and eventually receive concessions from the West. The reality is in brinkmanship, typically parties will begin with the mid-range of demands, make extremely increased, high, obscene demands, and then over time as tensions increase, decrease their demands as well. Now, it can be seen that this is not brinkmanship. Russia has steadily been increasing their demands. As tensions increase, if this were brinkmanship, Russia would be decreasing its demands. The reality is the level and severity of Russian demands have significantly increased, demanding that the international community recognize Crimea as a part of Russia and recognizing these separatist rebel regions as independent states is just increasing the demands of Russia. Now, the United States and the administration of Joe Biden have openly called this an invasion. The European Union has called this an invasion as well, though it was a little hesitant at first, and so was the United States. Now, the European Union has enacted unanimously its first level of sanctions, which are going to cover members of the Duma, Russia's Congress, or its parliament, that voted in favor of giving Putin the right to independently recognize the separatist regions in Donbas and giving him the approval to use military forces with sanctions, economic sanctions. These sanctions will also be targeting banks and will work to cut off Russia from the capital of the European Union and from European Union financial markets. The United States is going to formally announce its first level of sanctions today, though they are probably not going to be the full force of these massive crippling sanctions that were promised before, at least in the beginning. Most Western countries, including the United States, are waiting to see what Russia is actually going to do. And that is a mistake. This needs to be treated as a full frontal invasion, because at the end of the day, this is just a presage to one. And if the West doesn't take full actions and begin to cripple Russia's economy, Vladimir Putin and Russia are going to follow through and keep taking more and more territory in Ukraine. And for those of you who feel that Russia does not have ambitions to get more territory in Ukraine, the reality is Russia and Vladimir Putin have not just recognized the independence of the rebel-controlled regions of Donbas, they have also recognized territory that is controlled by Ukraine right now, specifically the extremely crucial, economically important, and militarily strategic key seaport in the Azov Sea of Mariupol, which is controlled by Ukraine, but Russia has stated that this is part of the separatist territory. So what happens? Are Russian soldiers going to assist its separatist rebels in attacking and taking back this land from Ukraine? That would simply lead to a war with Ukraine. The reality is Russia is going to continue grabbing and grabbing and grabbing until it is met with massive sanctions. Now, the US, the European Union, the UK, and other NATO allies are on the proper path to introducing stronger sanctions, but they need to be introduced now instead of waiting. Shockingly, the strongest and most outright response has actually surprisingly come from a nation and a chancellor that many people predicted would have the weakest response and avoid going into any kind of economic or diplomatic conflict with Russia because of the importance of the two countries' economic cooperation. Germany. Germany has already stated, and Chancellor Olaf Scholz have already began to shut down the bureaucratic approval of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is a pipeline that has already been built, though yet to begin operations, pending on approval by the German government, which it's not going to get anymore. It was going to, but it's not going to get after the Russian invasion of Donbas and Ukraine. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline was able to funnel direct natural gas from Russia directly into Germany, which was crucial to Germany. This was extremely important. Germany is a nation that uses a lot of gas and generally has a massive energy dependency and need for energy nonstop. It should also be noted that Germany has began to close its last 3 remaining nuclear power plants, while also completely phasing out coal power. Germany has never needed this gas more than it is needed it now, but it is willing to make the sacrifice to show the world that this is a serious invasion. And honestly, Chancellor Olaf Scholz has finally cemented himself as an assertive and dominant leader, which many people, including myself, have been laughing at since he just recently took the chancellorship. After his recent actions, I take back my criticisms, and this is actually an impressive move. Now, hopefully, the United States, under the Joe Biden administration, are going to take the same level of strictness to its sanctions. Hopefully, the European Union is going to up its game and introduce more sanctions alongside the United States, and so will the United Kingdom. Now, again, I am not against Russia here. I understand what Russia is doing is just trying to secure and act on its national and foreign policy and security interests. But the reality is that Russia has been extremely difficult to predict, and that's done intentionally. And nations that do that cannot be trusted fundamentally. And at the end of the day, sending in soldiers into Donbas is a violation of international law. Now, personally, I don't think international law really is that relevant. There is no large, massive body that can enforce international law. Sure, you have the United Nations who can condemn actions. And by the way, they have condemned the actions of Russia in Donbas. But there is no enforcement. International law only applies to very tiny, irrelevant nations that have no power on the global scene. International law does not apply to countries like Russia, like the United States, like China, who can afford to not be sanctioned. But the reality now is that the global community and the West, if it wants to work on its own security interests, needs to heavily sanction Russia, if not directly get involved with Ukraine. And it should be stated that I keep going back to the United States, but the party that has the most to lose here really is Western Europe. Russia is a nation that, if it does exact its foreign policy interests and secures its sphere of influence in Ukraine, Central and Eastern Europe, it is going to continue pushing west. Now, that's obviously not going to happen today or this year or in the next 10 years, but it will happen in the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, maybe even a century. If Russia is able to fully gain influence over Ukraine, it's going to look at who's next, which is Poland, a member of the European Union. And it can keep pushing to Germany, to France, to Spain, to Britain, if it is not contained. Now, again, I am predicting something that is unlikely to happen within the next 5 to 10 years, but it could happen in a century if Russia's actions in Ukraine are not right now and in the future contained. I'm going to end my report by saying this is an invasion, and the West has openly stated that it would, in the event of an invasion, introduce massive and crippling sanctions that would destroy the Russian economy. And they have yet to do so, which is making them look weak. Now, if you disagree with me, and there's probably a lot of you out there that do, please let me know in the comments and let's have a nice civil discussion about what's going on, an academic one, to see what's actually happening and see the different viewpoints that are out there. And I do want to make a full disclosure. I do really make an effort to be as unbiased as I possibly can. But at the end of the day, this is a podcast and I do have my own views, and occasionally in issues that personally affect me or the country that I come from, I'm going to give my opinion on it. And if you disagree with me, that's fine. Let me know and let's have a nice little debate. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.